A lookout reported 3 objects in the water off the starboard bow, dark, low, and round. They did not ride the swell the way floating debris rides it. They sat. Commander Paul Rinn came up to the bridge and looked at them. His ship was the Samuel B. Roberts, a guided missile frigate of the United States Navy, 4,000 tons, 2 years old, built for hunting Soviet submarines in cold North Atlantic water, and sent instead to the Persian Gulf, where the afternoon air was heavy and wet and the sea was the color of dishwater and did not move at all. She'd spent the morning escorting oil tankers. She was heading for a refueling rendezvous. Ahead of her lay the main deep water channel that every merchant ship in the Gulf used, a route that had been traveled without incident for 9 months. There were 3 moored contact mines in it. Rinn understood the arithmetic immediately. If he could see 3, there were more he could not see. His ship was not approaching a minefield. She was already inside one. He stopped her dead. He called the crew to general quarters. Then he gave an order that would decide whether men lived or died that day. He sent every sailor who could be spared up above the main deck, out of the engineering spaces because a mine hits from below and the people who die are the people standing over the keel. Then he began backing her out, astern, dead slow, along the exact track she had come in on. The reasoning was sound. Water she had already crossed was the only water in the world he had any evidence about. It was April 14th, 1988. The position was roughly 65 nautical miles east of Bahrain. At about 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon, with the ship crawling backwards at walking pace, the sea underneath her stern came up. For 9 months before that moment, the most powerful navy on Earth had been losing this fight. American warships had been escorting tankers through the Gulf since the summer of 1987. In that time, they had watched merchant ships burn. They had watched crews machine-gunned in the dark. They had almost never fired back because the rules of engagement were built for a war nobody wanted to admit was happening. The mines were the worst part of it. A missile can be jammed. An aircraft can be warned off. A speedboat can be challenged on the radio and tracked on radar. A mine gives you nothing. There is no contact to hold, no bearing to report, no target to engage. There is only water. And then there is a hole in your hull. Every answer the Navy tried had failed. Convoy routes were changed and the mines were relayed on the new routes. Helicopters swept and the fields came back. Mine hunters had to be borrowed from European allies because the United States Navy, the largest and most expensive fleet in human history, had let its own mine warfare force decay until there was almost nothing left of it. And on the very first escort mission of the entire operation, 3 American warships had been reduced to hiding behind a civilian oil tanker. Before we go further, I need to ask a small favor. Cold War Impact is a small channel covering Cold War and military history, and our reach has fallen off sharply this year. If you value research done properly, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video. Every interaction helps this channel find new viewers and lets me keep making documentaries like this one. Now, back to the Gulf. Here is a number. It will not mean much yet. $1,500. Hold on to it. By the end of this story, you will know exactly what it bought, exactly what it cost the United States to undo, and exactly why that ratio is still shaping the map of the Middle East. What broke the Iranian mining campaign was not a minesweeper. It was not a negotiated settlement. It was not a bombing campaign against Iranian soil. It was a single afternoon of surface combat, 4 days after that mine went off, in which the United States Navy fought the largest surface action it had fought since the Second World War, destroyed the core of Iran's operational fleet, and then deliberately stopped while its enemy was still afloat and burning. To understand how one afternoon reversed 4 years of war at sea, you have to go back to the moment the Persian Gulf stopped being a shipping lane. Nobody in Washington had quite worked out what was coming because the Navy was walking into a kind of warfare it had decided decades earlier that it did not want to think about. Mine warfare had been cut, defunded, and quietly forgotten. Tehran had noticed. The Iran-Iraq War started in September of 1980 when Iraqi forces crossed the border expecting a short campaign. Instead, they got 8 years of trench lines, human wave attacks, chemical weapons, and a death toll that nobody has ever managed to fix precisely. Estimates of the dead range from about 500,000 to more than 1 million. By 1984, the land war had stopped moving, so Iraq went looking for somewhere else to win. It found the sea. In the spring of 1984, Iraqi Super Étendard aircraft began firing Exocet missiles at Iranian oil exports. There were 5 of those aircraft, and Iraq did not own them. France had loaned them in October of 1983 as a stopgap until Exocet-capable Mirage fighters could be delivered, and took them back in 1985. The primary target was Karg Island, the terminal that handled almost all Iranian crude. The logic was cold and correct. Iran could replace infantry indefinitely. It could not fight without oil revenue. Iran could not stop the Iraqi Air Force. What it could do was make the entire Gulf unusable for everybody. If Iranian oil could not leave, then Kuwaiti oil would not leave either. Kuwait was financing Iraq, so Iranian gunboats began stopping neutral merchant ships and shooting them up. Iranian helicopters attacked tankers with anti-tank missiles. Iranian Phantom fighters carried Maverick missiles out over the shipping lanes. This became known as the Tanker War. By the end of 1987, according to the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, Iraq had carried out 283 attacks on shipping and Iran 168. Between them, they had killed 116 merchant seamen, wounded 167, and left 37 missing. Those men were civilians. Almost none of them were Iranian or Iraqi. They were Filipino, Indian, Greek, Korean, and Pakistani sailors working commercial contracts on ships that 2 governments had decided were fair game. In November of 1986, Kuwait asked the superpowers for protection. The Soviet Union answered first. It chartered Soviet-flagged tankers to Kuwait and provided escorts. That set off an alarm in Washington that had very little to do with oil and everything to do with the prospect of the Soviet Navy becoming the guarantor of Gulf shipping. So in March of 1987, the Reagan administration agreed to reflag 11 Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag. It was a legal device and everyone involved knew it. The ships were renamed. They were given American masters. They were inspected by the United States Coast Guard and entered on the American registry. That paperwork made them American vessels, and American warships could lawfully defend American vessels. The escort mission was called Operation Earnest Will. It began on July 24, 1987. It became the largest naval convoy operation since the Second World War. It began badly. The first convoy was built around the supertanker Bridgeton, formerly the Kuwaiti ship Al-Rekka, a vessel of just over 400,000 deadweight tons. Her escorts were the guided missile destroyer Kidd, the cruiser Fox, and the frigate Crommelin. Running past Farsi Island, the Bridgeton hit a mine. Accounts of the distance vary between 13 and 18 miles west of the island. The mine tore open a large section of her hull. She was so enormous and so heavily subdivided that she absorbed it. 4 cargo tanks flooded. She slowed down and completed the voyage. Her master, Captain Frank Seitz, said afterwards that the route had been compromised. He blamed American politicians for announcing the convoy's departure to the press after a meeting at the White House. But the Bridgeton was not the casualty that mattered. The 3 warships escorting her had no mine countermeasures capability at all. Not limited capability. None. No sweeping gear, no mine-hunting sonar, no dedicated sweepers anywhere in the theatre, and no idea where the rest of the field was. Their hulls were thin. Their machinery spaces had no armour. 1 contact mine would have sunk any of them outright. So they did the only thing left. They formed a single line astern of the wounded tanker and followed her, using 400,000 tons of civilian steel as a plough. Photographs of that formation went around the world. The Iranian Prime Minister, Mir Hossein Mousavi, called it an irreparable blow to American political and military prestige. For once, the propaganda was not much of an exaggeration. There is a reason it happened, and it is not a flattering one. Since 1945, sea mines have damaged or sunk more United States Navy ships than every other weapon combined. Every single time, the Navy has relearned this at great cost, funded a mine warfare program, and then let it wither the moment the shooting stopped. Mine warfare produced no admirals. It competed for money against aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, and it lost that argument every year for 4 decades. By 1987, the American Mine Countermeasures Force was a handful of aging wooden-hulled sweepers, most of them older than the sailors crewing them, and not one of them was in the Persian Gulf. What the Navy improvised was remarkable and inadequate. The amphibious assault ship Guadalcanal was sent out carrying Sea Stallion mine-sweeping helicopters of Helicopter Mine Countermeasures Squadron 14, which became the first American airborne squadron to sweep live-moored mines in combat conditions. Wooden-hulled sweepers were sailed out from the United States very slowly because they were never designed to cross oceans. And the Allies were asked for help, which is why British, French, Italian, Dutch and Belgian mine hunters ended up working the Gulf alongside the Americans. The mines kept coming anyway. In August of 1987, the tanker Texaco Caribbean struck one in the Gulf of Oman, well outside the war zone. The location was the message, and the men laying them were, for the most part, not the Iranian Navy at all. It is worth pausing on what this actually did to the people caught in it, because the strategic summaries tend to skip past them. A tanker is not a warship. It has no armour, no damage control party in the naval sense, and a crew of perhaps 25 to 40 men living directly above tens of thousands of tons of flammable cargo. When a missile or a rocket-propelled grenade goes into the accommodation block, there is nowhere to go. Several Iranian attacks were aimed at exactly that part of the ship, on the theory that killing crews would frighten owners into staying out of the Gulf. It largely worked. War risk insurance rates for Gulf voyages moved violently through the middle of the decade. After the attack on the Saudi tanker Yanbu Pride in May of 1984, hull rates for Karg Island reached 7.5% of the value of the ship. They were cut roughly in half the following January, then climbed again. By the end of the war, insurance claims arising from the tanker war came to around $2 billion, and about half of that fell on the Lloyd's market in London. Owners rerouted, waited out the worst periods, or paid to get crews aboard at all. When Chevron sent ships into the Gulf, it offered every man the choice of walking off, and paid a 100% bonus to those who stayed. Salvage tugs and firefighting vessels became a permanent industry in the lower Gulf. None of this was an accident. It was the point. Iran could not outshoot Iraq's air force, so it went after the commercial confidence that made the whole system function. A war fought against insurance underwriters is a strange kind of war, but it is a war, and for a while Iran was winning it. Iran fought this war with two navies, and the difference between them explains almost everything that followed. The first was the regular service, the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy. It was the direct descendant of the Shah's fleet. Its officers had been trained by the Americans and the British. It operated British-built frigates and American-built destroyers, and it carried a professional culture inherited from a state that no longer existed. It was competent, conventional, and deeply distrusted by the revolutionary government for the obvious reason that its senior officers had all been commissioned by the man the revolution overthrew. The second was the naval arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It was not a navy in any conventional sense. It had no cruisers and no doctrine inherited from anybody. It had speedboats, recoilless rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, converted merchant hulls, and mines. What it did have was total political reliability. Samuel Cox, the Director of Naval History for the United States Navy, has described the Guard crews bluntly. He called them religious zealots who were better at loyalty to the regime than at seamanship, and noted in the same breath that they were significantly more aggressive and more unpredictable than the professionals. Aggression, plus deniability, plus mines. That combination was the most dangerous thing in the Persian Gulf. The Guard's commander, Mohsen Rezi, had reportedly wanted to hit the first American convoy with speedboats. Accounts drawing on Iranian sources say Ayatollah Khomeini steered the plan towards mines instead. A special guard detachment laid a string of roughly 9 contact mines across the water that Bridgeton would have to cross. The mine itself was almost absurdly old. It was a moored contact mine of a Russian imperial design first drawn up in 1908. A steel sphere about a metre across, anchored to the seabed by a cable, floating at a preset depth below the surface. Protruding from it were soft lead horns. Inside each horn sat a glass vial of acid. When a hull bent a horn, the vial broke, the acid completed a battery circuit, and the charge went off. The standard variant carried somewhere around 115 kilograms of high explosive. It weighed close to 600 kilograms in total. It could be moored in water more than 100 meters deep. There was nothing electronic in it. Nothing to jam, nothing to spoof, nothing that could be decoyed or deceived. It was a weapon from the age of the dreadnought, and it worked exactly as well in 1988 as it had at Port Arthur. Iran had thousands of them. Estimates vary widely and should be treated with real caution. They range from about 1,000 at the low end to more than 6,000. The defense analyst Anthony Kordsman wrote that Iran held over 3,000 such devices. Some reporting has gone considerably higher. Nobody outside Tehran knew the true figure, and the uncertainty was itself part of the weapon. Iran's whole position rested on a single assumption. It is worth stating clearly because it was correct. The assumption was that the United States would not answer mines with force because mines are anonymous. Nobody watches them being laid. Nobody can prove whose hands put them there. And a superpower that cannot prove attribution cannot justify retaliation. Not to its allies, not to the United Nations, not to its own public. That assumption held for exactly 2 months. On the night of September 21st, 1987, a small Japanese-built landing ship called the Iran Ajr was moving slowly near the Middle Shoals buoy. She was showing no lights. Her stern ramp was down. She was being watched. Alongside Earnest Will, the escort mission everyone knew about, the United States had launched a second and largely secret operation called Prime Chance. Its job was to find the people laying the mines. Its most useful asset was an unlikely one. The Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment had brought Little Bird helicopters to the Gulf. Small machines flown by pilots trained for night work, operating from the flight decks of frigates. That night they were flying from the frigate Jarrett. Through night vision equipment, the crews watched men on the Iran Ajr rolling spherical objects down the ramp and into the sea. There was no ambiguity about what they were seeing. The order came back: stop the mining. The little birds attacked with miniguns and rockets and swept the deck. The crew broke off and took cover. About half an hour later, they came back out and started laying mines again. The helicopters attacked a second time. 3 Iranian crewmen were killed. 2 more were lost overboard. At first light, Navy Special Warfare teams boarded her. What they found aboard mattered far more than the ship did. They found mines still in the racks, they found charts, and critically they found a logbook recording where the vessel had operated and what she had put in the water. 26 survivors were taken into custody and later repatriated through the United Arab Emirates. The Iran Ajr was towed into deep water and scuttled. Her colours went back to the United States and sit in the Navy's collection today. Tehran denied everything. The official line was that the vessel had been on a civilian errand and had been attacked without cause. Less than a month later, on October the 16th, an Iranian Silkworm cruise missile fired from the Four Peninsula hit the reflagged tanker Sea Isle City in Kuwaiti waters and badly injured her American master. On October 19, the United States answered with Operation Nimble Archer. American destroyers shelled 2 Iranian offshore oil platforms that had been converted into radar and command posts and used to stage small boat attacks. The platforms were warned, evacuated, and destroyed. And here is the part that made everything afterwards inevitable. None of it worked. The capture of the Iran Ajr had handed the United States physical evidence. Not intelligence assessments, not intercepts. Actual mines with serial numbers stamped into the casings sitting in an American storage facility. The shelling of the platforms had demonstrated willingness to use force. Both events were supposed to establish deterrence. Neither did. The mining simply continued, more carefully now, laid at night from unmarked vessels in places nobody was watching. Iran had learned that a proportionate American response was survivable and concluded quite reasonably that the campaign could go on. 6 months later, that conclusion put 3 mines in front of the Samuel B. Roberts. There is one more thing the Americans built in that period, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The problem with hunting small boats and mine layers in the northern Gulf was distance. The Iranian craft operated from islands and inlets in shallow water. American warships were large, visible on radar for many miles, and could not loiter there without becoming targets themselves. Helicopters could reach the area, but not stay. So the Navy leased 2 commercial construction barges, the Hercules and the Wimbrown 7, and converted them into mobile sea bases. They were not elegant. They were flat, ugly, slab-sided platforms towed into position and anchored in the northern Gulf, fitted with helicopter decks, berthing, radar, machine guns, and defensive weapons. Aboard them lived Navy Special Warfare Teams, Army Little Bird crews, small patrol boat detachments, and the support staff to keep them running. What that gave the United States was persistence. Instead of sending a frigate up for a few days, the Americans now had a manned outpost sitting permanently in the water Iran considered its own, watching with attack helicopters ready at short notice and patrol boats able to intercept. The Hercules began running patrols in early September of 1987. The Wimbrown 7 followed in December and was anchored about 10 miles from her so the two could support each other. One clarification is worth making because it is often blurred. The capture of the Iran Ajr and the small boat action that October were both staged from frigates, not from the barges. What the barges provided was continuous presence and the patrols that came with it, week after week, in water that had previously been visited and then left alone. But a barge cannot sweep a mine. It could watch the surface, and it did that well. It could do nothing about a weapon sitting 15 feet underwater in a shipping channel 65 miles from Bahrain. The frigate that struck that mine had been in commission for 2 years. She had been named for a coxswain called Samuel Booker Roberts, killed at Guadalcanal taking a landing craft in under fire to pull out trapped Marines, and awarded the Navy Cross after his death. The second ship to carry the name had been a destroyer escort, sunk off Samar in October of 1944, while charging a Japanese battle line that outweighed her more than 100 to 1. Paul Rinn understood what he had inherited. He was from the Bronx. He had gone to Marist College, taken his commission in 1968, and served as a riverine advisor in Vietnam. When his ship worked up, he made damage control an obsession that other commanding officers found excessive. A large share of his crew had never been to sea before. He drilled them in darkness, in smoke, in breathing apparatus, until every sailor aboard could find every valve and every shoring locker by feel. The squadron rated his ship the best of her class. None of that looked especially important until 10 minutes to 5 on a Thursday afternoon. The mine went off under the stern on the port side. It lifted 4,000 tons of warship bodily out of the water. The blast broke her keel. It opened a hole in the hull that the Naval History and Heritage Command puts at 21 feet across. Other accounts give figures anywhere between 15 and 25 feet. It tore both gas turbine engines off their mountings and threw them across the engine room. Water came in through the breach faster than any pumping system ever fitted to a frigate could have handled. A fireball went up the stack. Fires started on several decks. 10 sailors were hurt. 4 were badly burned. Rinn had his foot broken by the shock. Computer modelling done afterwards concluded that the Samuel B. Roberts should have sunk. She stayed up because of what her crew did over the next 4 hours. They shored bulkheads with timber and with anything else that came to hand, including their own clothing forced into fractures. When the superstructure began working loose along the crack in the hull, sailors ran steel cables around it and winched them tight, physically tying the ship together. An engine man named Mike Tilley attempted what engineers call a suicide start. He used the last flask of high-pressure air aboard to try to light off a generator, knowing there would be no second attempt and that failure meant no power at all. It worked, and Rinn made one decision that cut against everything he had been trained to do. He realized his own firefighting water was sinking the ship faster than the hull was. Tons of it were pouring into spaces that could not drain, so he ordered the fires left to burn and put everything into the flooding. Within the first half hour, she stopped settling. By about 5:30, the water was holding 6 inches below the deck plates. The injured were flown off by Sea Knight helicopters from the stores ship San Jose. The 4 worst burn cases eventually went to a military hospital in Germany. At some point that night, the commander of the Middle East Force, Rear Admiral Anthony Less, came up on the radio and asked Rinn directly whether he was considering abandoning ship. Rinn said he was not. Then he signed off with the ship's motto. It was the same phrase the captain of the 2nd Samuel B. Roberts had used in his after-action report from Samar, having watched his crew fight a hopeless action to the finish. No higher honour. Not one man aboard was killed. She was towed into Dubai on April 17th and put into dry dock. Later she crossed the Atlantic on the deck of a Dutch heavy lift ship, the Mighty Servant II, and went to Bath Ironworks in Maine. There the entire engine room was cut out of her and a 315-ton replacement module was welded in. She undocked for sea trials on April 1, 1989. Bradley Peniston, whose book on the ship is the definitive account, records the outcome precisely. The work cost $89.5 million, $3.5 million less than expected, and the sea trials that followed showed her performance was better than new. Now recall the number from the beginning. The mine had an estimated cost of $1,500. Against the repair bill alone, that is an exchange ratio of roughly 60,000 to 1. It does not count what the frigate cost to build. It does not count the Allied mine hunters deployed, the helicopter sorties flown, the convoys delayed, or the insurance premiums that reshaped Gulf shipping for a decade. A weapon designed before the Titanic sailed, costing less than a second-hand car, laid by men working in the dark off the ramp of a converted landing craft, had come within one flooded compartment of destroying a modern American warship. That is the mathematics of asymmetric warfare, and the United States Navy learned it that April in the most direct way available. But there was one more piece, and it turned an accident into grounds for war. While the Samuel B Roberts was being stabilized, Navy divers and explosive ordnance disposal teams went into the water and recovered other mines from the same field. They brought them up intact. Then somebody compared the serial numbers on those casings with the serial numbers on the mines seized from the Iran Ajr 7 months earlier. They matched. Sources describe them as identical or sequential. Same production batch, same stock, same hands. The anonymity of the mine, the single property that had made the entire Iranian campaign possible, evaporated in an afternoon. What nobody in Tehran had accounted for was that the United States had been sitting on the evidence since September, waiting for a reason to use it. Between April 14 and April 17, the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the White House argued about the response. There was pressure to escalate hard. Proposals reached the table for strikes on the Iranian mainland, on naval bases, on oil infrastructure. All of them were rejected. Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Frank Carlucci, the Secretary of Defense, both pushed for something unmistakably decisive that could still be defended in law as self-defense. President Reagan authorized it on that basis. The instructions that came down were narrow: destroy 2 offshore platforms being used as military command, surveillance, and staging posts, and sink the Iranian frigate Sabalan, whose commanding officer, Captain Abdullah Manavi, had earned the nickname Captain Nasty among merchant crews for the practice of deliberately firing into the accommodation blocks of ships. He stopped. Explicit caveats were attached about avoiding civilian casualties and limiting environmental damage in an already fragile sea. The operation was named Praying Mantis. Before we walk through it, understand how unequal the coming fight actually was. The outcome was not a matter of courage, it was a matter of physics and of procurement decisions made 20 years earlier. Iran's principal surface warships were 4 frigates of the Alvand class, built in Britain by Vosper Thornycroft and delivered between 1971 and 1972. They were the Alvand, the Alborz, the Sabalan, and the Sahand. Each displaced around 1,100 tons standard and about 1,500 at full load. Each carried a 4.5-inch gun forward, Sea-Killer anti-ship missiles, and Sea-Cat short-range surface-to-air missiles. Every one of those weapons was a mid-1960s design. The Sea-Cat in particular had to be flown onto its target by an operator watching through an optical sight and working a joystick. In daylight, in good visibility. Against a jet actively trying not to be hit. Against a modern standoff attack, it was close to useless. Against those ships, the United States could field the Harpoon, a sea-skimming anti-ship missile with an active radar seeker that flew itself to the target from beyond the horizon. It could field the Standard missile designed to shoot down aircraft, but usable against surface targets. It could put intruder attack aircraft overhead, carrying laser-guided bombs, cluster munitions, Walleye glide bombs, and Skipper rocket-boosted weapons, in whatever mix the mission required. It had Tomcat fighters above that, radar aircraft building a surface picture hundreds of miles across, and electronic warfare aircraft to blind whatever Iranian radar was still working. Iran's fleet was also in far worse shape than the order of battle suggested. David Crist, whose history of the American confrontation with Iran is the standard work, documents the problem. On paper, the regular Iranian Navy had about 18 surface combatants. 8 years of war and a total arms embargo had left spare parts so scarce that the genuinely combat-capable number was effectively half that. Only around a tenth of the fleet was at sea at any given moment. The real burden fell on those 4 British-built frigates, and in its entire inventory, Iran had exactly 1 working Harpoon missile. It had been bought from the United States before the revolution, when Iran was America's closest partner in the region and received the best equipment American industry produced. There would never be another one. 1 functioning anti-ship missile. Against a carrier battle group. The Iranians knew all of this. They came out anyway. There is a reason the crew of the Samuel B. Roberts was ready in a way that crews often are not, and it has a name. On May 17, 1987, 11 months before the mining, an Iraqi Mirage fighter fired 2 Exocet missiles at the American frigate Stark in the Central Gulf. One of them failed to detonate. The other did. 37 American sailors were killed and dozens more were injured, and the ship very nearly burned to the waterline before her crew stopped the fire. The Stark was Iraqi. Iraq was, in every practical sense, the side the United States was tilting towards. The attack was almost certainly a mistake by a pilot who had lost track of what he was looking at. That did not make the funerals any smaller. What the Stark did to the surface fleet was change the culture overnight. Damage control stopped being a qualification and became a preoccupation. Ships deploying to the Gulf drilled harder, stocked more shoring, ran more casualty exercises, and thought seriously about surviving a hit rather than avoiding one. Paul Rinn had already been running his ship that way. After the Stark, nobody thought he was being excessive anymore. 11 months later, a warship that computer models said should have sunk came home under tow with every man aboard alive. That was not luck. That was 37 dead sailors and a fleet that had finally paid attention. April 18, 1988, began before dawn with 3 American surface action groups already in position. The aircraft carrier Enterprise was operating in the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz, with her air wing ready. The task force was directed from the flagship Coronado by Rear Admiral Anthony Less. He was the same officer who 4 days earlier had asked Paul Rinn whether he intended to abandon ship. Surface Action Group Bravo was led by Captain James Perkins, commander of Destroyer Squadron 9. It consisted of the destroyer Merrill, the guided missile destroyer Lynd McCormick, and the amphibious transport dock Trenton. The Trenton carried a Marine contingency force built around a company of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, with Cobra gunships and Sea Knight transports embarked. Its target was the Sassan platform complex, known to the Iranians as Salman, Surface Action Group. Charlie consisted of the guided missile cruiser Wainwright, the frigate Bagley, and the guided missile frigate Simpson. Its target was the Sirri platform. Surface Action Group Delta was the group assigned to hunt the Sabalan. It consisted of the guided missile destroyer Joseph Strauss, the destroyer O'Brien, and the guided missile frigate Jack Williams. At 5 minutes to 8 in the morning, radio operators aboard the Merrill began broadcasting to the men on the Sassan platform. They warned them in English, in Arabic, and in Farsi to get off the structure. They gave them a deadline. That detail deserves a moment because the whole legal architecture of the day rested on it. This was intended as proportionate force against military targets, and the Navy went to considerable trouble to make sure the people on those platforms had a chance to leave. Most of them took it. Some did not. At 4 minutes past 8, with the deadline gone, the Merrill opened fire with her 5-inch gun, using airburst rounds set to detonate above the platform. The Iranians fought back. A 23mm anti-aircraft gun on the structure opened up and was silenced almost at once by a direct hit. Marine Cobra gunships came in and put anti-tank missiles into it. At around 25 minutes past 9, Marines landed on the burning platform by helicopter. They moved through it, collected documents and equipment, and found 1 wounded Iranian who was evacuated for treatment. Then they placed roughly 1,200 pounds of explosives, pulled back, and destroyed the platform. Bravo was ordered on towards a second platform, Raksh. Partway there, the order was cancelled. The second demolition was called off deliberately, as a signal that the United States was not seeking a wider war. While Bravo was working, Surface Action Group Charlie opened fire on Sirri at around 5 minutes past 8. The 5-inch guns set it alight almost immediately. The fires took hold so violently that the planned boarding was judged both unnecessary and unsurvivable. Sirri was destroyed by naval gunfire alone. Iran had lost 2 platforms in 90 minutes. Its response came from 3 directions. The first was the fast attack craft Joshan, a French-designed missile boat of the Carmen class, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Abbas Malek. She came out of Bandar Abbas and steered straight for Surface Action Group Charlie. What followed was one of the strangest exchanges in modern naval history, because most of it happened on the radio first. Captain Dave Chandler, commanding the Wainwright, warned the Joshan repeatedly to turn away. Malek answered. His reply is on the record. He said he was doing his duty, that he was in international waters, and that he would commit no provocative attack. The Joshan kept coming. Chandler's warnings escalated until he transmitted in plain language a message that has been quoted many times since. "Stop your engines. Abandon ship. I intend to sink you." The Joshan answered by firing her harpoon, Iran's last one. The only functioning anti-ship missile in the entire national inventory, purchased years earlier from the country it was now aimed at, launched at an American cruiser from about 10 miles. The American ships fired chaff. The missile went through the decoy cloud and missed. What became of it afterwards is not clearly established in the record. What is clear is that it hit nothing and that Iran had just expended its single most capable weapon at sea. The reply took seconds. By the Naval History and Heritage Command's account, the Simpson fired 4 standard missiles in the surface mode and the Wainwright fired 1 and all of them hit. Some accounts give a lower number for the Simpson. The Joshan's superstructure was wrecked and her weapons and sensors destroyed, though the hull stayed up. The Bagley launched a harpoon that is reported to have missed. Later in the afternoon, the 3 ships closed on the burning hulk and finished her with 5-inch and 76mm gunfire. That was the first exchange of anti-ship missiles between surface warships in the history of naval warfare. It lasted minutes and it was entirely one-sided. It also gave the Simpson a distinction she carried until the day she was decommissioned. She was the last ship in the United States Navy to sink an enemy warship. The second response came from the air. At around 10 minutes to 1 in the afternoon, Iranian Phantom fighters approached Surface Action Group Charlie. The Wainwright fired 2 extended-range standard missiles. One detonated close enough to the leading Phantom to tear away part of a wing and drive fragments through the fuselage. The aircraft turned and made it back to Bandar Abbas, which says a great deal about both the airframe and the pilot. The third response was the one that had made Iran genuinely dangerous for 4 years. At around 1:30, Revolutionary Guard speedboats came out and attacked shipping in the Mubarak oil field off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. Their targets included an American-flagged supply vessel called the Willie Tide, a Panamanian-flagged jack-up barge called the Scan Bay with 15 American workers on it, and a British tanker called the York Marine. This created a problem that went straight to the top. The Scan Bay was not American-flagged. Neither was the York Marine. The entire justification for Earnest Will had been the protection of ships flying the American flag. Over a communications link running through the Pentagon and the White House, President Reagan personally authorized the strike. It was the first time in the whole Gulf operation that the United States used force to defend a vessel that was not sailing under its own flag. Intruder aircraft from Attack Squadron 95 flying off the Enterprise went in with cluster munitions. Lieutenant Commander James Engler and Lieutenant Paul Webb sank the lead boat. The rest scattered towards Abu Musa, several of them driving themselves up onto the beach. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, the regular Iranian Navy committed its frigates. The Sahand came out of Bandar Abbas alone under a captain named Sharokfar, who had a reputation in his own service for aggression. 2 intruders flying surface patrol ahead of the Joseph Strauss found her. She opened up on them with guns and launched surface-to-air missiles. By every available account, her crew fought her hard and made no attempt to disengage. What happened next was a demonstration of everything the American Navy had spent 20 years and enormous sums learning to do. The intruders attacked with harpoon missiles and laser-guided skipper weapons. Almost simultaneously, the Joseph Strauss fired a harpoon of her own. It is widely described as the first coordinated combat attack in which anti-ship missiles were launched by aircraft and by a surface warship against the same target at the same moment, though the claim is repeated more often than it is sourced. Timing an attack like that, without the weapons interfering with each other, is far harder than it sounds. More aircraft joined and added a Walleye glide bomb, general purpose bombs, and cluster munitions. The Sahand was hit repeatedly and burned. The fire worked through her and reached her magazines. She exploded and sank. The light was going and more intruders were inbound when the Sabalan came out. She was sister ship to the Sahand and the primary target of the entire operation. Her captain was the officer the merchant fleet called Captain Nasty. He steered directly at the American aircraft and fired a surface-to-air missile at an intruder flown by Lieutenant Commander James Engler, the same pilot who had sunk a speedboat earlier that afternoon. Engler put one 500-pound laser-guided bomb straight down the Sabalan's stack. It detonated in the engine room. The frigate lost all power instantly and stopped dead, stern settling, burning, with no propulsion, no working weapons, and no way home under her own steam. Surface Action Group Delta was closing on her. More aircraft were overhead with ordnance still on the racks. She was the ship Washington had specifically ordered sunk. Finishing her would have taken about 5 minutes. The decision went back up the chain to the Pentagon in real time by satellite radio. This was a genuinely new and uncomfortable feature of the operation. For the first time in a naval battle, the National Command Authority in Washington could watch a fight develop and intervene in individual engagements. Historians have argued about it ever since because it takes judgment away from the officer who can see the water and hands it to men thousands of miles away who cannot. On this occasion, it produced restraint. Frank Carlucci asked Admiral Crowe what should be done. Crowe's answer survives in several forms. The most quoted version is that they had shed enough blood for one day. The order came back to break off. The Sabalan was left burning and helpless. Iranian tugs came out and towed her to Bandar Abbas, where she was repaired. American forces were told to stand down into a defensive posture. Iranian shore batteries fired Silkworm cruise missiles at American ships during the day, and every one of them missed, beaten by decoys and by maneuver. By nightfall, the shooting had stopped. Then, after dark, the United States took its only casualties of the entire operation. A Marine Sea Cobra gunship of Marine Light Attack Helicopter Squadron 167 was flying reconnaissance about 15 miles southwest of Abu Musa. It went into the sea. Both crewmen were killed. They were Captain Stephen Leslie, age 30, of New Bern, North Carolina, and Captain Kenneth Hill, age 33, of Thomasville, North Carolina. Their bodies were recovered in May and the wreckage was raised. The cause has never been established, and the record genuinely diverges here. Navy officials who examined the wreckage said it showed no battle damage and concluded the crew may have crashed while maneuvering at low level in darkness to avoid Iranian fire. The author Lee Allen Zatarain has pointed to evidence that the helicopter may have been brought down by fire from Abu Musa itself. Both accounts remain in the literature. Neither has been proved. 2 men. That was the entire American cost of the largest surface engagement the United States Navy had fought in more than 40 years. Putting a number on what Iran lost that day took years, and parts of it are still contested. The material losses are clear enough. The frigate Sahand sunk. The missile boat Joshan sunk. The frigate Sabalan crippled and out of the war. At least one Revolutionary Guard speedboat confirmed destroyed, with claims running as high as 3 and several more damaged. A Phantom fighter damaged. 2 militarized platforms destroyed. On the American side, 2 Marine aviators and 1 helicopter. No American ship hit. The human cost on the Iranian side is where the record becomes unreliable, and an honest account has to say so. The best supported figures are the ones for individual ships. The Naval History and Heritage Command puts the Sahand's losses at least 45 killed and the Joshans at 15. That gives a combined total of around 60 for the 2 ships. Aggregate figures are looser. One commonly cited total is more than 60 Iranian dead and 100 wounded across the whole day. Another widely repeated account gives 56 dead for the Sahand and the Joshan together, which does not sit comfortably alongside the component numbers. No complete Iranian casualty roll has ever been published in the West. Treat every total you see, including the ones in this video, as an estimate. Now, the claim in this video's title. The claim that the United States sank half the Iranian Navy in a day is repeated almost everywhere, and it needs care. It is not true that half of Iran's total naval strength was destroyed. The Revolutionary Guard's fleet of small craft was numerically the larger force and did most of the actual attacking, and it came through the day essentially untouched. What is true is that the day gutted Iran's operational conventional fleet. Follow David Crist's arithmetic. The regular Navy's practical fighting strength rested on 4 British-built frigates. One of those 4 was sunk. A second was crippled and taken out of the war. Add the Joshan, and Iran had lost in an afternoon roughly half of the major surface combatants it could actually put to sea and fight with. Half the operational fleet, not half the Navy. That is the accurate version, and it is remarkable enough without inflation. The scale of the engagement needs the same treatment. The Naval History and Heritage Command describes Praying Mantis as the largest of 5 major American surface actions since the Second World War. It was the first and so far only occasion on which the United States Navy has traded surface-to-surface missile fire with an enemy, and it produced the largest enemy warship the American Navy has sunk since 1945. The naval historian Craig Simons has ranked it among the 5 most significant sea battles in American history. The qualifiers matter. There have been very few post-war American surface actions to compare it against. Measured against Jutland or Leyte Gulf, it was a skirmish. Measured against the last 80 years, it was the largest thing there was. The strategic effect is harder to pin down and far easier to overstate. One result is unambiguous. Iran laid no further minefields against Gulf shipping. The campaign that had run for 9 months and come within one compartment of sinking an American warship simply stopped. The larger question is whether any of this helped end the Iran-Iraq war. And here the disagreement among historians is about weight rather than about facts. On the same morning American guns were firing at Sassan, the Iraqi army launched a major offensive and retook the Four Peninsula, ground Iran had paid for in enormous casualties. A declassified American intelligence assessment, cited in later reporting, concluded that Iranian leaders believed the American attack had been deliberately synchronized with that offensive and that they were now facing the United States and Iraq together. They were not synchronized. The timing was coincidence. But what an adversary believes usually matters more than what is true. By that summer, senior Iranian commanders, including Mohsen Rezai, were reporting to the leadership that victory was not achievable for years, if ever. The country was economically finished. Its cities were being hit by Iraqi missiles. Its soldiers were being gassed. Then, on July 3, 1988, the American cruiser Vincennes engaged with Iranian small craft in the Strait of Hormuz, shot down Iran Air Flight 655 with 2 Standard missiles. The aircraft was an Airbus airliner on a scheduled flight to Dubai. All 290 people aboard were killed, including 66 children. The United States said the crew had misread the contact as an Iranian Tomcat fighter descending into an attack run. The airliner was in fact climbing away from Bandar Abbas on a scheduled departure. Iran said the shoot-down was deliberate. The evidence supports the American account of a catastrophic misidentification by a tense crew working from a confused tactical picture. The effect in Tehran was to convince a great many people that the United States would now kill Iranian civilians at scale. On July 20, 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, the ceasefire he had rejected for a year. He said that taking the decision was more deadly than drinking from a poisoned chalice. The ceasefire took effect on August 20. The honest conclusion is that Iran stopped because it was exhausted, and that the events at sea convinced its leadership that continuing meant fighting the United States as well. Praying Mantis did not end that war. It closed the last door. There is one more piece of the accounting, and it took 15 years to arrive. In November of 1992, Iran took the United States to the International Court of Justice over the attacks on the oil platforms. The legal basis was a 1955 Treaty of Friendship between the two countries which, remarkably, was still technically in force. Judgment came on November 6, 2003, and it went against both parties. The court found that the American attacks on the platforms could not be justified as measures necessary to protect essential American security interests. On the central question of the mine that hit the Samuel B. Roberts, the court found the American evidence highly suggestive but not conclusive. It noted that both Iran and Iraq had been laying mines in the Gulf, and that matching serial numbers, while indicative, did not by themselves meet the standard the court required. But the court also, by 14 votes to 2, refused to uphold Iran's claim that the United States had breached the treaty's freedom of commerce provisions, on the grounds that the platforms in question were not producing oil at the time. Iran's claim for reparations therefore failed, and by 15 votes to 1, it dismissed the American counterclaim against Iran. Neither side got damages, neither side got vindication. Anyone quoting the first half of that judgment without the second half is not telling you the truth about it. The people involved came out of it the way people usually do, which is unevenly. Paul Rinn received the Legion of Merit with Combat Distinguishing Device, presented by Admiral Crowe, and the Navy League's Stephen Decatur Award. He went on to command a guided missile cruiser and to serve as a commander of the Iraqi embargo operation. He retired in 1997 as a captain. He was never selected for flag rank, which a number of his contemporaries regarded as a plain injustice, given that he had brought home a ship the models said should have gone to the bottom. He was inducted into the Surface Warfare Hall of Fame in 2008. For the rest of his life, he pushed the credit onto his crew and onto Mike Tilley in particular in almost every interview he gave. He died suddenly in Boston on August 3, 2022, age 75, while preparing a talk on leadership at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Lieutenant Commander James Engler, who crippled the Sabalan and sank a speedboat in the same afternoon, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain Stephen Leslie and Captain Kenneth Hill received what is given to men who die in helicopters at night during operations that never get called a war. Their names are on a memorial. Outside the Marine Corps, almost nobody has heard of them. On the other side, Captain Abdollah Manavi survived the destruction of his ship, stayed in the Iranian Navy, and reportedly rose to Vice Admiral. The doctrine that put those mines in the shipping channel did not die at Sirri or Sassan. Iran still fights the Gulf with two navies. The regular service operates further afield now, showing the flag in the Indian Ocean and beyond. The Revolutionary Guard still owns the Strait of Hormuz and the shallow water, and it still relies on exactly the tools it used in the Tanker War. Swarming small craft, anti-ship missiles, mines, and now, in very large numbers, armed drones. Estimates of the current Iranian mine stockpile still run into the thousands, and they still include large quantities of simple contact mines of the kind that broke the Samuel B. Roberts. The tactics have lasted because they keep working. In May and June of 2019, tankers in the Gulf of Oman were attacked with limpet mines. On June 13th, 2 ships were hit, the Kokuka Courageous and the Front Altair. American Central Command released video and a recovered magnet and attributed the attacks to the Revolutionary Guard. Iran denied involvement in almost the same words it had used about the Iran Ajr 32 years earlier. The seizures have gone on as well. The British tanker Stena Impero in 2019, the Advantage Suite and the Niobe in 2023, the St. Nicholas in January of 2024, and the MSC Ares that April. The international answer has followed the old pattern too. In September of 2019, a coalition called the International Maritime Security Construct was established in Bahrain, bringing together the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others under a combined task force to escort and monitor shipping. It is Earnest Will with new letterhead. And there is one development that would have troubled Paul Rinn a great deal. In September of 2025, the last of the 4 Avenger-class minesweepers based in Bahrain was decommissioned. That ended more than 3 decades of dedicated forward-deployed American minesweeping in the Persian Gulf. The mission has been handed to littoral combat ships carrying modular mine countermeasures packages built around unmanned surface vessels, helicopters, and standoff sensors. Those packages had a long and troubled development. Specialist naval press has questioned whether they are ready, and senior officers have publicly acknowledged that purpose-built ships remain the best answer to dedicated mine warfare. Which is to say, the Navy has once again decided that mine hunting is somebody else's problem in the same body of water where it learned twice that it is not. In June of 2025, after American and Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, the Iranian parliament voted to endorse closing the Strait of Hormuz. Final authority for that decision sat with the Supreme National Security Council. The strait was never closed. Oil markets spiked briefly and then decided closure was unlikely, on the reasonable grounds that Iran ships its own crude through the same water. But the threat keeps its force for precisely the reason it had force in 1987. Somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of all seaborne oil trade passes through that strait, and the cheapest way on Earth to interfere with it is a steel sphere full of explosive anchored to the seabed, costing about what a used car costs. The Samuel B. Roberts was decommissioned in May of 2015. No American warship carries her name today. The Sabalan, the ship Carlucci and Crowe chose not to finish, was towed home, repaired, and modernized in the 1990s, with Chinese-supplied missiles replacing her obsolete British ones. She was still in Iranian service and still taking part in exercises as recently as 2025. There have since been reports based on satellite imagery and open-source analysis rather than any official confirmation, suggesting she may have been lost in more recent strikes. Those reports are unverified, and this channel is not going to present them as fact. For 9 months, the most powerful navy in the world was held off by a device invented before the Titanic sailed, not because it could not be countered, because nobody could prove who had put it there. That whole campaign was built on one thing, and it was not explosive. It ended when a diver came up out of the water beside a broken frigate holding a mine casing, and somebody read the number stamped into the steel. Everything that happened 4 days later followed from that. Not from the guns, from the paperwork, which is the part that should worry anybody watching the Gulf now. The mines are still down there. The stockpiles are larger. The men who lay them are better at not being seen. And the ships that used to go looking for them have gone home.